Late one evening, just after midnight, a quiet residential block in the United States appeared completely normal. Porch lights glowed softly, windows were dark, and families slept unaware that danger was unfolding inside one ordinary-looking house. Inside that home, a young child wearing green sat frozen in fear, held silent by threats she barely understood, while an armed intruder moved nervously from room to room, watching the street, waiting for the right moment to leave. He believed the neighborhood's silence protected him. He believed no one would intervene. But everything changed in a single second when the child, overwhelmed by fear, made one instinctive decision and screamed. It was not loud at first, more of a broken cry, but it carried desperation, a sound that cut through the night air and reached a nearby house, where a woman sitting in her living room paused. Something about that scream felt wrong. It wasn't playful, it wasn't anger, it was terror. And instead of convincing herself it was none of her business, she acted, dialing 911 with shaking hands and telling the dispatcher that she believed a child was in danger. The dispatcher, wearing cap, did not hesitate and immediately flagged the call as high priority. Nearby patrol units were notified. Among them was a veteran police officer nearing the end of his shift. When he heard the call, he felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Cases involving children always demanded speed, precision, and courage. He turned his cruiser toward the address, activating lights but keeping sirens low to avoid alerting anyone inside. As he arrived, he noticed a detail that stood out instantly. The front door of the house was slightly open, just enough to suggest haste. The officer, wearing police uniform with green jacket, exited his vehicle slowly, hand near his weapon, senses alert, and as he approached the house, he heard muffled movement inside and a faint whimper. That was enough to confirm his fear. He radioed for immediate backup and announced himself loudly as police. There was no response, only hurried footsteps and the sound of furniture scraping. The officer knew waiting could cost the child her life, and in that moment, he made a decision that would define the entire outcome. He entered the house, moving carefully through the hallway, every second stretching into something heavy and dangerous. He reached the living room and saw the child pressed into a corner, her face streaked with tears, while the suspect stood between her and the back door holding a weapon. The tension was unbearable. The officer kept his voice calm, steady, commanding the suspect to stop and drop the weapon. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between the officer and the child, calculating his chances. Outside, backup units arrived silently, positioning themselves around the house. Inside, the officer continued speaking, slowing the moment down, reminding the suspect that escape was impossible, that no one needed to get hurt. Seconds passed like minutes, and then the suspect made a sudden movement toward the door. The officer reacted instantly, tackling him to the ground as backup officers rushed in. The weapon was kicked away, handcuffs snapped shut, and the danger ended just as quickly as it began. The child collapsed into the officer's arms, shaking uncontrollably, but alive. Paramedics arrived shortly after, and investigators began processing the scene. What they discovered later was chilling. The suspect had a history of violent offenses and had been actively planning to leave the state that same night. Had the officer waited even a minute longer, the child would have vanished without a trace. Interviews revealed that the suspect relied on hesitation, on people ignoring what felt uncomfortable, and on the belief that screams at night were someone else's problem. But this time that belief failed him. The neighbor's decision to call 911, the dispatcher as urgency, and the officer as willingness to act without delay aligned perfectly. The case never became national news. There were no viral headlines, but within law enforcement circles it became a powerful example of how one scream, one decision, and one moment of courage saved a life. The officer later stated that he did not feel like a hero. He simply refused to ignore what mattered. The child was reunited with her family days later, her recovery slow but hopeful. And while she may never remember every detail of that night, her life stands as proof that awareness and action can stop evil before it succeeds, because sometimes the line between tragedy and survival is not time, not technology, but a single human decision made when it matters most. After the arrest, the house fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of police radios and the child's quiet sobs as paramedics carefully examined her. Officers secured every room, knowing that scenes like this often hide details that explain how close disaster truly came. Detectives arrived shortly after and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. This was not a random break-in or an impulsive act. Evidence scattered throughout the home told a different story, a calculated one. The suspect had maps marked with nearby routes, handwritten notes listing times when streets were quiet, and a bag packed with items suggesting he planned to disappear before sunrise. Further investigation revealed he had been monitoring the area for days, watching families, learning routines, and waiting for the right moment. The child had been targeted because she was alone for just a short window of time, a detail the suspect believed no one would notice. Back at the station, the veteran officer gave his statement, describing the decision to enter the house without waiting for full backup, a choice that would later be reviewed carefully by supervisors. Body camera footage showed the intensity of the moment, the controlled tone of the officer's voice, the fear on the child's face, and the exact second when hesitation could have turned fatal. Command staff reviewed the footage and agreed that the decision likely saved the child's life. Had the suspect reached the back door, there would have been no immediate trace, no witnesses, and very little chance of recovery. Detectives also learned that the suspect had been questioned in another state months earlier for suspicious behavior, but released due to lack of evidence. A reminder of how predators often exist in the gaps between jurisdictions, prosecutors quickly moved to file charges, including kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and weapons offenses, ensuring the suspect would not see the outside world again for a long time. Meanwhile, the neighbor who made the 911 call was interviewed and admitted that for a moment, she almost ignored the scream, thinking it might be none of her business, a thought that haunted her when she realized how close she came to doing nothing. The child's interview was handled by specialists trained to work with young victims, and through gentle conversation, she explained how she screamed despite being threatened, how she believed someone might hear her, and how that hope kept her going. Officers listening behind the glass exchanged quiet looks, understanding that bravery does not always come from strength, but from desperation mixed with hope. Days later, the child was reunited with her family, the moment emotional and overwhelming, tears replacing fear, and silence replaced by relief. The officer attended briefly, standing in the background, uncomfortable with attention but deeply aware that this was the outcome that mattered. The case moved through the courts swiftly, supported by strong evidence and clear timelines, and while the public never heard the full story, inside law enforcement circles it became a reminder that danger often hides behind ordinary doors. That screams are not noise, they are warnings, and that when police act decisively and citizens trust their instincts, even the darkest intentions can be stopped before they succeed. In the final outcome, the courtroom was quiet as the verdict was read, guilty on all major charges, bringing an end to a case that had begun with a sound almost no one noticed. The suspect was led away in handcuffs, no longer a hidden threat, but a reminder of how close tragedy had come. The judge spoke briefly about the severity of the crime and the irreversible harm that could have occurred, making it clear that society had been protected because people acted when it mattered. Outside the courthouse, there were no celebrations, only relief, the kind that settles slowly after fear has passed. The officer returned to duty soon after, back to night shifts and quiet streets, carrying the memory of that house and that scream with him, not as pride, but as responsibility. The neighbor who made the call returned to her normal routine. Yet she later admitted that she now listens differently, that silence no longer feels empty, but meaningful. The child continued her recovery surrounded by family, therapy helping her rebuild a sense of safety, her courage spoken about quietly among professionals who understood what it took for her to scream despite fear. The case was later used in police training sessions, not as a dramatic story, but as a lesson that instincts matter, hesitation can be dangerous, and action saves lives. It reminded officers and civilians alike that evil often depends on being ignored, on people assuming someone else will respond. But on that night, someone did respond. A scream was heard, a decision was made, and a life was saved. And while the world moved on unaware of what nearly happened, the truth remained unchanged. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the darkest moment is not strength, not weapons, Not authority, but the courage to make a sound and the willingness of others to listen. And that is where this story ends, with danger stopped, a child safe, and the reminder that one scream, one decision, and one act of courage can change everything. Long after the case files were closed and the evidence boxed away, the impact of that night continued in quiet, unseen ways. Officers who had reviewed the footage carried its lessons into future calls, responding faster, listening closer, trusting their instincts. When something felt wrong, community meetings referenced the case without naming it, reminding residents that safety is often built on attention rather than fear. The officer involved was never comfortable being associated with the story. Yet years later, he admitted that it changed how he understood silence, teaching him that danger rarely announces itself clearly and that waiting for certainty can sometimes be the most dangerous choice of all. The child grew older in a world that never knew how close it came to losing her, her memory of the night fading into fragments, but her life moving forward because courage spoke when it had to. And somewhere in that same neighborhood, nights returned to being quiet again, not because evil no longer existed, but because it had been stopped once by awareness and action, the kind that does not seek recognition or reward, only results. And in the end, that is the lasting truth of the story. Not the arrest, not the courtroom, not the badge, but the reminder that lives are often saved in moments no one sees, by people who choose to listen, choose to act, and choose not to ignore the sound that tells them something is wrong. And that quiet understanding is what allows this story to finally rest, complete, unresolved by drama, but resolved by survival. And when time finally placed distance between that night and the present, what remained was not fear, but meaning, the kind that settles quietly and reshapes how people see the world around them. The city returned to its routines, patrol cars continued their rounds, neighbors slept through the night, and life moved forward as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet beneath that normalcy lived a truth that would never change. A child was alive because silence was broken, because hesitation was rejected, and because action arrived at the exact moment it was needed. The officer never spoke publicly about the case again, not out of secrecy, but out of respect, knowing that some victories are meant to be carried, not displayed. The neighbor who made the call never knew the child's name, never saw her face, but lived with the quiet certainty that listening had mattered, and the child herself grew in safety, unaware of the chain of decisions that protected her. But living proof that courage does not need an audience to be powerful. The case faded from memory, replaced by new calls, new dangers, and new nights. Yet its lesson endured where it mattered most, in the minds of those who choose to pay attention, who understand that evil often depends on being ignored, and that the smallest sound can stop the darkest outcome. And that is where this story truly ends, not with sirens or headlines, but with a simple, undeniable truth. One scream was heard, one decision was made, one life was saved, and because of that, everything else was allowed to continue. And the child herself grew in safety, unaware of the chain of decisions that protected her. But living proof that courage does not need an audience to be powerful. The case faded from memory, replaced by new calls, new dangers, and new nights. Yet its lesson endured where it mattered most, in the minds of those who choose to pay attention, who understand that evil often depends on being ignored, and that the smallest sound can stop the darkest outcome. And that is where this story truly ends, not with sirens or headlines, but with a simple, undeniable truth. One scream was heard, one decision was made, one life was saved, and because of that, everything else was allowed to continue. And life moved forward as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet beneath that normalcy lived a truth that would never change. A child was alive because silence was broken, because hesitation was rejected, and because action arrived at the exact moment it was needed. The officer never spoke publicly about the case again, not out of secrecy, but out of respect, knowing that some victories are meant to be carried, not displayed. The neighbor who made the call never knew the child's name, never saw her face, but lived with the quiet certainty that listening had mattered, but her life moving forward because courage spoke when it had to. And somewhere in that same neighborhood, nights returned to being quiet again, Not because evil no longer existed, but because it had been stopped once by awareness and action, the kind that does not seek recognition or reward, only results, and in the end, that is the lasting truth of the story. Not the arrest, not the courtroom, not the badge, but the reminder